I want to ask both Jim and Georgia, and in a way members of the audience, the question about the vocabulary and values associated with collective well-being, because the benefits that every citizen enjoys are a consequence of collective efforts historically. If you even take the business of healthcare, it has nothing to do with the brilliant surgeon or the brilliant physician, but rather with the sudden, or with the eventual rather, availability of public hygiene. So what's this mismatch between the fascination with individualism and the realization, on the other hand, that most of the benefits have been achieved by collective effort? It's a kind of cultural mismatch it's a kind of schizophrenic situation that people are brought up in.
I think the mismatch is moving, and I think that you can see that when you look, and I mean, this is incredibly problematic to cite a Trump campaign, but I think if you look at a bunch of the populist messages that Trump ran on, he's not implementing them, and you awkwardly and artificially remove the explicit racism that underpinned his entire campaign. He ran on a message that said that I will repeal Obamacare, but I will make sure that everyone has better coverage and everyone has access to good healthcare. He ran on a message that was about jobs for people and about rebuilding communities. If you look at the Brexit campaign that was run by Boris Johnson, it was predicated on pulling the money out of the EU and reinvesting it into the NHS. And if you look at the Libs, and I never give them credit for anything, but if you look at the Liberal budget, it speaks to the fact that there is a resonance in the community of the ideas of the left. That actually was it the 2014 budget that was the total disaster one? Yeah. The 2014 budget taught them a lesson, in a sense, which was that truly the practice of neoliberalism, there is not an appetite for that in the Australian community. And my mum always says, and I shouldn't refer to my mother multiple times, but she would appreciate it, my mother always says that the left is always right in the end. And she means that in that we're always correct, and that the arc of, the Martin Luther King quote about the arc of, the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice. It does, but it requires us to pull it towards justice. It doesn't bend that way naturally. I think that people are experiencing, and particularly in the UK and the US, where the GFC was not insulated by the banking regulation and by the once-in-a-lifetime resources boom as we were in Australia, people have had the experience of individualism, and it is turning them back towards the experience of government intervention and a collective approach to those basic kind of services. What is missing is leadership. The Labour Party in the UK is incredibly depressing. The Democrats is depressing. I wish Jeremy Corbyn all the best, but they're not, shining stars at the moment. And the ALP here are not showing leadership on this issue. They're absorbing the neolib message and responding to it. So I think there's a gap of leadership, but I think people experience the impacts of individualism. They understand it, and they understand the value of collectivism. They just don't have a language and a way of engaging in it.
Look, yeah, that was very. Actually, it's hard to follow, but. Oh, well, no, it's not that hard to follow because, look, I think Georgia nailed something there. And again, like when you talk about, a question as difficult and as apparently simple as like, why is the vocabulary of collective actions that have dropped away, yeah? That is an answer, that it's not. And for some, it's not. But the flip side is I actually think for many people it has. And I wish this was my idea, but it's not. Everyone familiar with Hugh Mackay, the demographer? I saw him give a presentation a number of years ago, and it stuck with me, where he talked about the explosion of cooking shows and fitness shows and home renovation shows things which were like really unimaginable a generation ago. I mean, you might like cooking, or you might like mending, or you might enjoy your training, but the idea of this kind of, social kind of concern around these kind of individual exercises. And he said, you hear lots of people whinging about this. Oh, it wasn't like that in my day, and look at these, entitled, children carrying on. And his argument was really interesting. He said, look, in a world where living in a public collective space actually doesn't deliver you what you need, right? So for previous generations, being collectively engaged and having the vocabulary of the collective, you actually got results. It gave you dignity. It gave you wage rises. You could afford to buy a home. You could actually have a sense of belonging and realness. In a world where that isn't the case, it doesn't make sense for people to, at a psychological level, to feel like they're wearing a hair shirt. I mean, like, the hard left always do this, we try to keep the flame alive. But for lots of other punters, rather than sitting there thinking, oh, capital's beaten me, and I'll keep talking about the collective, but I recognise I've been beaten, you adapt and you take pleasure and control where you can find it. And it becomes the individual. And then someone makes a buck off it, and you see, MasterChef. So the thing that he was starting to nail was that the decay of that language is an entirely rational response for people who want to have a modicum of joy and control in their lives, who've been denied having that at a collective level because our side has been losing. So for mine, I think that the way you turn it around, and this is a very limited example, but when people join the fire brigade, right, permanent firefighters, you have classes of 20, and someone like me goes out and stands over them, and that's why we have 100% density. Now, the people who join, generally about 1/3 have had a collective, kind of history in another union, which is higher than the national average, but still 2/3 don't. But they all join because they feel like, it's the first day in this bizarre new world and everyone's doing it, so I have to, and this guy's got a membership card with my name on it, and, I feel like I have to do it. And look, that's what we do. Make no bones about it. It's a compelling argument, but we go out there to just say, you are joining. They don't leave because they join a space where it actually makes sense. They start to rediscover a collective vocabulary because they're living in a world, the work world, where they can actually see that that collective identity is one of the things which determines the way their life is. Now, that's a very shallow example in one tiny industry. The point I make, though, if in 2017 people who've had no experience of that vocabulary can adopt it so quickly because it actually makes sense, it's materially there for them, then it can happen anywhere. The challenge isn't whether it can be done, it's how to be done. And if I had the answer to that, it'd be a different world, really, wouldn't it? Yeah.
Thanks for your speech. What do you think the role of the union is in regards to the challenge of automation?
I'll be real quick. I think it's enormous, and I think the sense of how do we surf that wave of automation and really the way the movement of data and the depth of data and how that starts to impact is so phenomenal. Look, just by coincidence, I heard it today. They say that people being born today, 70% of them will be doing jobs that haven't been invented yet. I think what they didn't add was that, or no job at all. Again, look, I think it's yet another huge challenge. But if we don't surf this wave, it's going to crash over us. And all I can do is recognise it's a wonderful question. How we go about it, I don't particularly know. Apart from actually saying, again, if the actual existing movement isn't capable of trying to direct stuff, then we'll have no control over it at all.
And what I would say is it's not a new thing, right? Like, there was horseshoe people who suddenly lost their jobs because cars came along. Like, we have been surfing this wave forever. It feels intense. It feels like there's a significant shift in our economy, and I don't want to discount that by any stretch of the imagination, but we've always had to evolve. And if we don't figure it out, we are going to face a crisis. But I think unions are trying to figure it out. I think there's automation. We cover paint manufacturing workers, for example, and their jobs are being lost hand over fist. There's no new paint manufacturing factories being built. The challenge is finding good, meaningful jobs for those people. They're on 100K a year. those workers. They work shifts, they're in high density areas, they have an experience of work that is about dignity and about being able to provide for their family. And what we're seeing is an economy moving to a service-based model that doesn't provide those kind of conditions. And we need to have a conversation as a country about what we want our economy to look like. And if service jobs are the jobs of the future, how do we make those good jobs? How do we make those jobs that there is dignity and you can support your family?
Thank you, and I appreciate your sharing your thoughts and words. And I think you hit the nail on the head with regard to finding a right framework. And the problem I see is that we seem still trapped in the very same framework that got us where we are today. We still rely on the same framework that the politicians base the rhetoric on to convince the public and even argue with us. We fear automation. That's one. And other than automation, the other challenge is that we are forced to compete with the lower wages of developing economies to the extent that we will be willing to import cheap labor from abroad on a temporary basis, whether it's virtual or actual. So my question really is how willing is the labor movement willing to explore alternative strategies when it might actually mean you will have to change drastically. It may mean you may have to diminish and relinquish your power to the worker for more participation. It may mean that you may have to relinquish or change the entire power structure of the hierarchy, that the movement may end up becoming flat. How willing are we willing to do that? I'm not sure if that's a rhetorical question.
It's a great question. I mean, I'm almost going to postpone the meeting and invite everybody to return tomorrow for a 3-hour seminar on that question. But anyway.
I'd respond in two ways, and the first way is I know New Zealanders are not meant to talk shit about Australians, and I don't. I live here. It's great weather. And, you know, Australians are fine. But the New Zealand union movement got the shit kicked out of it in 1991. They passed an act that got rid of awards overnight. Gone. All of the award structure. So when I moved to Australia, I didn't know what an award was. We only had individual agreements and the occasional collective agreement that was only in the public sector. What I would say about that, and they got decimated, right? Like they turned off payroll deductions overnight, so all the public sector unions were destroyed. They got rid of awards. They set up a process of competitive unionism, and we ate each other. But the density that is held by New Zealand unions in a legislative context that is much more problematic than the Australian is as high, if not higher. We don't have the same political capital, the New Zealand union movement, and we don't have the same cultural influence, but I have a theory that because we got the shit kicked out of us, we are a more nimble group of organisations. And I worry that the Australian union movement thinks that work choices was rock bottom and it wasn't, and that we haven't quite had the come to Jesus moment that we need in order to respond in the way that is required by the changing economy and the changing political discourse. I think in a lot of ways we're still antiquated, and I say that in the same way that I talk about my mother. I know the mother. God, you should meet her. She's terrifying. But I think that there are some organisations that are truly grappling with this issue, and I'm proud of my organisation that we are one of them. I would like to pretend that it's because we're forward-thinking, but I think it's just because we need to survive. But there are a lot of us, and I say us in terms of unionists, who are more interested in protecting individual or institutional power than we are at grappling with the challenges we face. And that's incredibly scary because we don't have time anymore.
Look, I think it's a really good question, rhetorical or not, and I actually think, you know, I concur with everything George has said. What I would add is just to say this, like to actually answer your question, how willing, I reckon we're up for it, But I honestly don't think that the majority of the union leadership in Australia is, and I don't actually at some level even judge them for it. Like, these are people who are steering a movement in crisis, trying to keep it alive as best they can. And there's a whole sense of, this is the kind version, a whole sense of kind of like, organisational pride about trying to make sure that it doesn't be that, that they're not the last captain on the ship. And then the flip side is there's a whole stack of institutional power still tied up in it. So you look at the kind of arrangements that the AWU ran, the sweetheart deals they ran. You look at the way the SDA organises. You look at the corruption inside the HSU, and like they're no longer overtly corrupt, but the relationships between unions like the HSU and the Labor Party. And that sense of direct transmission between actually existing parliamentary locus of power and what our movement is, it's real. And while it sometimes can deliver results, it also delivers a particular outcome, which means there's power there which people won't give up lightly, and that's the end of it. The 1969 strike I referred to, Clary O'Shea, that strike occurred in spite of the fact that Victorian Trades Hall and the Labor Council of New South Wales both did their level best, to the point of actually getting thugs involved to stop it growing. So the official movement at a high point in 69 actively tried to block one of the finest moments our movement's ever seen. And that's the nature of the game. Yeah, I think that's entirely to be expected. People behave in the same way today. So my takeaway out of all of this is that when you say, will the unions today, the union leadership today is not going to be a part of the solution. Hopefully they keep the show running until that solution arrives. And that solution is leaders and activists and fighters who I'm yet to meet, but I am gagging to.
You may have already answered this question, but I'm just sitting here thinking what needs to happen to bring people back into unions? Just what do you think needs to happen?
Well, Jim's standing over them for a start. and then bringing George's mother on board, as far as
Look, if I had the answer, actually no, I was going to say if I had the answer to that, I'd be leading the ACTU, but I wouldn't with my political pedigree. Look, the only thing I do know is that people, Keating said it, self-interest is a horse that runs a good race. So success attracts success, and the reason why the bastions of high density maintain it is because when people join, it makes sense for them to join, because that's actually how you look after yourself. It doesn't answer what you do when your density is 5% or 10%, apart from what people have been trying to do forever, which is identify spaces inside that where you can start to defend and expand. But look, the only insight I've got is that people don't join unions. No, most people don't join unions, have a misty-eyed commitment to a better world. They join for a better world for them, and rightly so. So the challenge has always got to be about how do we make sure that our movement can actually deliver modest but real gains, which means that people want to be a part of it.
When I was organising railway workers, I ran this training with a whole bunch of delegates who'd worked for the railways for like 40 years, and we were talking about how important it was that delegates recruited new workers in their workplace, and they were all like, yeah, like when I started, someone just came up to me with a union card and said, you've got to join. And I was like, yes, I am making real progress with these delegates. They are going to start recruiting. And then we got to this point where we were talking about the union picnic, and they were like, Georgia, so we're going to go to the union picnic, but you're going to come and do all the recruitment conversations, right? And I was like, oh, God damn it. I hadn't made any of the progress that I thought I had. I think the most powerful people to join people up to unions are union members. They're not union organisers, they're not union officials. It is the conversations that happen in the workplaces. And those conversations don't happen anymore, and they don't happen because people internalise a whole bunch of the rhetoric that comes from neolibs about what unions are, or they see it as a risky thing for their career and all of that kind of, and they feel vulnerable in doing it, and they feel like they're asking people to do something for them as opposed to asking people to take an opportunity to act in their own interest. So I think there's a real challenge around that, and I think fundamentally we unionists need to step up in their own workplace. What the challenge we face is that our people don't have workplaces anymore. So home care workers work in their cars and they work in the homes of their clients, and they don't see each other. They used to come together for training and now it's delivered online, and they used to come together to pick up their rosters and now they have an app on their phone. So we need to figure out how to deliver the experience of collectivism that the firefighters get, and the joy of taking action as a collective, and the value of taking action as a collective in a different way to people who don't understand themselves as being part of a workforce or part of a collective. And so we need to innovate. We need to not expect people to come to us and engage with us in the way that they always have and speak our language. We need to figure out how to engage people where they are and take them on a journey.
Georgia mentioned the H.R. Nichols Society. Why did Kathy Jackson seem to like to go down there? And while I'm speaking on the Health Services Union with Craig Thompson and them, I've got no objection if a union official wants to go to a hooker, but I think he should pay for it out of his own pocket.
Agreed. Strongly agreed.
Yeah, and I mean, the Health Services Union lost a hell of a lot of members during that time. Yeah.
Can I say something on the Health Services Union though? Because one of my best friends joined the Health Services Union just after, they all got rolled out and they got new leadership. And I was like, what are you doing? Like, why are you going in there? And he said, look, I believe in union, and I think that health workers need a good union. And I think that this union is genuinely committed to a reform agenda, and I want to be part of that change. And the Health Services Union is growing, which most unions can't say, to be honest. And I think there has been some radical reform. Is it the union that I would, design? Not necessarily. It's a New South Wales ALP right union. But they're incredibly vulnerable workers, particularly aged care workers, cleaners in hospitals, people without qualifications. And they work incredibly hard and they deserve a good union. And I think that union is on the right track to being the union that those workers deserve. But yeah, the horror of having to be a unionist in a world where Kathy Jackson and Craig Thompson is, and having Craig Thompson and Williamson is hideous because it's completely indefensible and it brings us all down. What I would say though is that people don't extrapolate corporate fraud or bad CEOs or the 7-Eleven to every retail store in the country. They don't take the one example and say this is what corporates are like, and they do that to the union movement, and they do that because the neolibs capitalise on a crisis.
Okay, look, I'm just going to roll it up with this isn't a question because it would take us for the rest of the year to answer, but there's an elephant in the room on these issues, and it's called work. And it's about in a way you implied, it's about redefining, not only redefining what we mean by work, but trying to establish whether it's necessary to work a 40-hour week or a 35-hour week. I mean, one of the topics later in the agenda of Politics in the Pub is about universal basic income. So the issue then becomes, can there be sufficient income for everyone? And over and above that, what percentage of people will be involved in rewarding work? I mean, that's a huge issue. What do you mean by work? I mean, Turnbull has proposed this week to raise the pension age until 70. But most of the people I interviewed about that issue many years ago were in jobs that they didn't want to do. They couldn't wait to do something productive with their lives. So I just, it's very naughty of me from the chair to raise that question, but it's a huge one, which both of you, in a way, have implied is important, and we'll have to be more explicit about it in future. The only commercial I've got tonight is one that Geoffrey's given me, which is about a seminar. It's an easy question. Is Australia prone to a financial crisis, and what can we do about it? And it's going to be held in Little Eveleigh Street, 122, on this Sunday afternoon from 2 to 4, and the speakers are both significant members of the convening committee of Politics in the Pub, Geoffrey and Joe. Next week, the topic is about that amazingly creative Centrelink robot debt recovery scheme, okay? So, look, on your behalf, let me thank Georgia and Jim again. They've given us a first-rate analysis that we need to go away and think about a great deal. And it's a shame that anybody thought that instead of attending the Writers' Festival functions. But thank you both very much.
Thank you, Stuart.